Hi, I'm Debbie Randolph, and I'm here with Ann Rowson Love, and we wish we were in Ireland. We're going to talk to you today about situating contemporary artist practice within a feminist inquiry. This is from a book that we're working on that will be out in the spring. I'm the principal researcher and co-founder of the organization International Scholars Group, but I'm also a curator of education, and my last job was with the Southeastern Center for Contemporary Art.
And I'm Ann Rowson Love, and I'm an associate professor and director of museum education and visitor-centered curation, an MA and PhD program at Florida State University, where I also work very closely with our partner museum, the Ringling in Sarasota, Florida.
So the new book coming out in 2021 is The Introductory Guide to Qualitative Research in Art Museums. The book is in 3 sections. The beginning is just an introduction to qualitative research. The middle and the primary bulk of the book is the methodology chapters. There are 9 of them. And the final part of the book is actually an analysis of a study that we're doing within the book, where we're interviewing several researchers from across the world about their work in qualitative work in art museums. The feature that we want to talk to you about is called an artist segue, which introduces each chapter with artist work that their practice mirrors the methodology. And that is part of why we wanted to talk to you today about these artists.
Right. And to give a little more context into feminist inquiry, within the book that Debbie shared, we sort of frame our view throughout the book through a feminist lens. We're very, like we will be here in this presentation, very conversational, as well as thinking about selecting these artists through the lenses of feminist inquiry that you see here on the left. Additionally, today, what we're going to be thinking about is how 5 of the 16 artists that we incorporate into the book or feature in the book come from a place of a feminist world viewpoint, and then often blend that viewpoint with another worldview. And when we talk about worldviews, such as a feminist approach or other, we're really thinking about how artists discuss or create the intentions of their work. And it can fall into these worldviews.
So this is a worldview that we developed for the book. A worldview, as you I'm sure know, is just the philosophical framework, background, impetus for the work that is going to be discussed. We have 4 categories: feminist, of course, pragmatist, constructivist, and deconstructivist. I hope you can see what's under each of them. For example, under deconstructionist, we have postmodern, post-colonial. Under pragmatist, we're thinking about the problem-based, participatory. So we're using each of these in our descriptions of the artists, and we think that their practice actually echoes these worldviews.
And just so you can see all of the artists that we worked with, there are 16 that are being featured in the book. And today we're going to sort of focus in on 5 different artists and their working methods and worldviews through a feminist inquiry lens. The first we'll explore is Jennifer Drinkwater. She truly embodies a feminist worldview in her work that's from a series called 168 Hours, which is the amount of time in a week. These 2 publications, which you may be familiar with, People Magazine and Time Magazine, are both published on the same day every week. They are owned by the same company. Yet one, Time Magazine, is often thought of as the more serious journalism, perhaps maybe more masculine because of that, and also patriarchal in some ways, while People may seem more on the frivolous side, may also represent more gossip-oriented approaches to article, more entertainment-oriented, which has a more feminist leaning. That is the way that this artist is sort of thinking about creating these works. She calls them diptychs, which is sort of reminiscent, harking back to the Renaissance period and after of European tradition of having portraits that are shown together. So she really sees these as portraits, and specifically picked her medium and her working process of a traditionally female craft, cross stitch, to share the works over time. This is a long-term series. It takes her a long time to work on these pieces individually, and there are many sets of these diptychs that she has added to the series over the past several years.
Our second artist is Will Hutnick. So Will is an artist that Anne and I met when we were at a artist residency in Hambidge Art Center in Georgia. We met Will and were very drawn to his work. And this piece is "And You Can Tell Everybody," which I think is really talks about his work in queer theory. He works in mixed media and repurposed collage. This particular piece is acrylic, colored pencil, ink, and spray paint on canvas. He likes to explore an other undefined space that exists between familiarity and underlying deviations, corruptions, and objects in transition. I think in some ways Will might feel like brings his own feeling of transition and queerness into the work. He's very inspired by a book, Cruising Utopia by Jose Esteban Munoz, which examines queer futuristic spaces and talks about queerness as being on a different timeline that grapples with the past and the present simultaneously. Will talks about his own work as thinking about queer spaces and queer landscapes. Will is a cartographer in his work. These pieces always kind of map out a certain journey, whether it's a journey of identity or a journey in a particular place. He also is looking at the in-between spaces, the weaving back and forth, as you can see by the two pieces almost, the two sides almost having this electric response with one another with that white space in between. You see hidden pieces and the color in the pop of color in the bottom of the piece that is a rainbow, which often shows up in his work. He kind of thinks about this as warped, bringing on a different plane, which you can absolutely see in this piece. We feel very fortunate to have met Will. Christina Kim. Christina is an artist that we have not met, but we saw her in her work in an exhibition called Scraps at the Cooper Hewitt, which is the Smithsonian Design Museum, and actually presented at Arts and Society in Paris about scraps. So I'm going to talk to you about what this piece is made from. It's made from a process of Indian weaving that is called jamdani, which is woven fabric and cotton with bits of gold and silver thread woven within it. It's very sheer and fine and creates kind of a floating, shimmering surface. So jam means flower and dani means vase. And you kind of can feel that in this piece where the flowers are popping up in the fabrics. It's actually made of scraps. When Christina Kim went to India in 1996 and saw this process, but noticed that all these wonderful scraps of this beautiful fabric were just lying on the floor and discarded, she decided to take the scraps and make applique designs from this fabric, from the scraps of this fabric.
Yeah, and you can imagine too with these pieces that the original intention of Jamdani is to make saris, traditional saris that are custom ordered and designed. In this case though, what Christina Kim is doing in her very strong interest in zero waste fashion manufacturing, she is combining both a feminist ideology here and creates many of her works for women specifically, or homes, interiors, with a pragmatist, so with a designer's focus on solving a problem. And that's what she focuses on in her work. And the resulting pieces like this one, which is now part of the permanent collection at the Cooper Hewitt, reflects that idea of solving a problem and coming up with a new solution and a new work, one that can also be worn. So it's not just a work of art that hangs inside of an art gallery, although this one does. It can also be worn by the purchaser.
Renee Stout. Renee had an exhibition at the Ogden Museum where Ann and I met. We both were in the education department at the Ogden Museum of Southern Art in New Orleans. And this was the last exhibition prior to Katrina that was at the Ogden. And we chose this piece. We really wanted Renee to be in the book, and we chose this piece because we felt like it was very representative of the historical work that Renee is known for. Her work is very embedded in her own spiritual and historical journeys of her ancestry, and especially the women that are part of her ancestry. So she often looks back at that, looks at the narrative of her family history, and also looks at the spiritual parts of not only her world, but also those that were in the past. She's very drawn to places like New Orleans. She works a lot with the voodoo religion. Many of her pieces are altars. So she's looking at that, but she's also kind of telling you the story through her pieces, vocalizing and bringing the narrative of the story through the pieces. So they're very discursive pieces. So her work, which is primarily found object and photograph and lots of mixed media and installation, we feel like her work is feminist because she brings in a very critical race theory to the work, and she's also brings in a feminist viewpoint. But it's discursive, but it's also sociocultural, meaning that she brings her own world into it. She brings her history into it. It's a very personal piece for her. All of her work is very personal, and it's very discursive. So this is one of the pieces called Lay Your Hand on Radio, 2009, 2014. And do you have anything to add? No?
I was only going to maybe say something about a constructivist worldview, which really does do these things that Renee blends, which is looking at her own past history and building something new and something forward. And that's very much a constructivist viewpoint. It is sociocultural because she's examining her own roots and ancestry and trying to have a dialogue with museum visitors through this. but constructivist in that it's a building block from history into the present. And that fits within that sort of more of a pedagogical worldview in a way. Pete Hoffaker Mejia is an artist that we'll finish up with today. And we're looking at a piece here that's untitled. Pete is also an artist that we met at the Hambidge Center when we were working on our book there. And we're really fortunate to meet him as well and learn more about his work. We say that he comes from this sort of feminist background. As he states, he is expressly concerned with exploring the intersection of contrasting cultural information, hierarchies of representation, and conflation in the expression of otherness. That is a quote from the New American Painting Journal. He was born in Bogota, Colombia, and he was raised here in the US by an American family of mixed race. And he talked quite a bit about that and how he's trying to explore, to rediscover his ancestral identity, as well as the one he grew up with in the southeastern United States, Tennessee. So while he's doing that and thinking about his own discussions within identity, he's also deconstructing and dealing with post-colonial theoretical orientations too, which he also states that he is interrogating the themes of European geometric abstraction, which we can see in this piece, and indigenous art forms, which allow him to create a sculptural narrative of contemporary Latin American and indigenous cultural hybridity with the acknowledgement of post-colonial landscape, again, quoted from New American Paintings. And here we see those emphases coming together with little bits and pieces of textiles from Latin America, as well as constructions that are very geometric and confined in their space. And even the imagery of the house, that he is thinking about home and identity and blending all of these aspects together. And one thing when we think about a deconstructionist worldview is that in a very literal sense, this artist doesn't always keep this work intact as we saw it, this very piece at the Hambidge Center, which has now been disassembled, so quite literally deconstructed, and will be formed into new pieces in the future. So he has some very strong ties to both of these worldviews. And I think one of the points we really want to make about worldviews with the researchers we talk about in the book, and also the artists that we're featuring through their artistic processes, is that we often don't have just one worldview or orientation. We're often blending. And that's really what we wanted to kind of show artists who start from within sort of feminist philosophies that gave way to queer, critical race, critical disability, critical placemaking, and discursive operations, but also seeing that there's some blending with other worldviews as well, which we tried to demonstrate in this presentation. Here's a reference to our forthcoming book we're excited to share with you, as well as the artists who we talked about today. And finally, our contact information. We'd love to hear from you more about this piece. Any questions or concerns or comments you would want to make. And finally, Debbie, we have a couple minutes where you can tell us a little bit about this artist we keep featuring.
Yes, this artist is Taha Hadari's work. It's called The Museum, and it's a wonderful piece that was shown in the Southeastern Center for Contemporary Art. What he does in his work is he just magnifies and looks at very closely historic moments, things of our history, things that have been important to him in his life. He's an Iranian artist who lives in the United States. And I think this particular piece is so important today. It's the museum as it would be if it was just left to its own devices, if it was just there without visitor, without anyone trying to manipulate what it was about. So I think perhaps it is almost a symbol of what is happening right now in our world, and we are excited. We think it's going to be the cover of the book. So, The Museum by Taha Haderi. Thank you for watching our presentation, and please email us with any questions or comments.
Thank you.